What happens when corrupt cops vanish and the city starts to change? The ones who once ruled the streets now live in fear, but if they ever dare to return, they have no idea who's already waiting for them. James "Pop" Walker had seen a lot in his 74 years. Good times, hard times, and the kind of struggles only a black man in the South could understand. But today, standing outside the Wells Fargo in South Atlanta with a thick envelope in his wrinkled hands, he felt something rare. Relief. This money, $4,200 in cash, was everything he had managed to scrape together. The roof on his little house was leaking, his medical bills were piling up, and his granddaughter's birthday was coming. Pop had never been the kind of man to let life get ahead of him, but lately it had been trying real hard. He adjusted his cap, stuffed the envelope into his coat, and started his slow walk home. That's when he heard it, the low growl of a police cruiser rolling up beside him. Pop had lived long enough to know trouble when he saw it. The black and white squad car stopped just ahead, its tires crunching against the curb. Two cops stepped out, one stocky with a mean little smirk, the other lanky with shifty eyes, Officers Greggs and O'Reilly. Pop kept walking. He wasn't in the mood for trouble. "Hey, old man," Greggs called out, the smirk widening. "Everything all right?" Pop stopped, forcing himself to stay calm. "Just heading home, officer." O'Reilly squinted, his eyes darting to the bulge in Pop's coat pocket. "What's in the envelope?" Pop's stomach tightened. He knew where this was going. "Just my savings," he said, his voice steady. "Money I took out the bank." Greggs let out a short laugh, stepping closer. "Oh, yeah? And you're sure it's yours?" Pop frowned, gripping the envelope tighter. "Yes, sir. It's mine." Greggs reached out and snatched it right from Pop's hands. No hesitation, no shame. Just pure authority. Pop's heart pounded. "Give that back," he said firmly. "That's all I got." Greggs whistled as he flipped through the bills, then looked at O'Reilly with a grin. Looks like a whole lot of cash for an old man just walking home, don't you think?" O'Reilly shrugged. "Could be anything. You know, unreported income. Some under-the-table dealings. Maybe something worse." Pop felt his hand shake. "This is my money. I worked for it." Greggs's face darkened. "You're getting a little loud, old man." He stepped in closer, gripping Pop's collar just tight enough to make a point. "You resisting?" Pop froze. He'd seen how this played out before. The answer was always, "No, sir." Always. Greggs held his stare for another few seconds before smirking again. He patted Pop's chest twice, condescending, before letting go. "You have a good night now," he said, sliding into the cruiser. O'Reilly pocketed the envelope as he climbed in after him, and just like that, they were gone. Pop stood there, his fists clenched, his breath coming sharp. They had taken everything. He swallowed hard, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone with trembling fingers. There was only one person he could call. He pressed the number, his voice steady despite the fury burning in his chest. "Son, I need you." Thousands of miles away, in a place where the sun burned high and the air smelled like dust and sweat, Sergeant Elijah Grizzly Walker sat in the back of a military transport truck, staring out at the endless stretch of desert. His uniform was stiff with dirt, his face streaked with dried sweat, and his boots that had carried him through some of the worst places on earth, were caked in dust. The mission was over. Another nameless operation in another nameless place. He had seen things today, things that most people wouldn't believe if he told them, but none of it mattered now, because the moment his boots touched American soil, none of that world followed him home. That was the deal. You leave the battlefield behind, you breathe, you pretend the nightmares aren't waiting for you on the other side of the airport terminal. That was the deal, but when his phone vibrated in his pocket, he knew some battles don't stay overseas. Elijah barely looked at the screen before answering. "Dad." His father wasn't the type to call unless it was serious. "Pop." His voice was steady, controlled, but the second he heard the way his father breathed on the other end, something inside him shifted. "James Walker, was a proud man. He was the kind of father who never asked for help, who handled his problems alone. If he was calling his son, his Green Beret son, then something was wrong. "Son," James's voice cracked, just a little. "They robbed me." Elijah felt his pulse slow, not in fear, but in that dangerous way it did when his mind locked into something serious. "Who?" His tone changed, sharpening like a blade. A pause. Then his father said two words that made the entire world stop. "The police." Elijah closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to process it. "They took my money," James continued, his voice strained, like he was trying to keep his emotions in check. "Everything I had, right outside the bank. They pulled up, took it right out of my hands, and drove off laughing like it was nothing." Elijah's jaw tightened. His father, his blood, robbed by the people who were supposed to protect him. "Did they put their hands on you?" His voice was low now, almost too calm. "No, but now I can't pay my bills, and your niece's birthday is coming up." Silence. Elijah stared at the dirt beneath his boots. His breathing was slow, calculated, the same way it was before he kicked in a door in the middle of the night. The same way it was before a mission that wouldn't make the news, but would change the world in ways no one would ever know. His teammates, hardened soldiers who had seen him walk into war zones like a ghost, noticed the shift in his posture. Something had changed. And when Elijah finally spoke again, his voice was ice. "I'm coming." The call ended. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Elijah sat there for another few seconds, his mind already breaking down the situation like a tactical briefing. Enemy forces, 2 uniformed officers, primary objective, recover stolen assets, secondary objective, ensure permanent resolution. Then he stood up. He didn't need to pack. He didn't need to think. Because in his mind, this was already a mission. And the enemy? They had no idea what was coming. The plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, but Elijah Walker wasn't thinking about homecomings. He wasn't thinking about warm hugs or catching up with old friends. He had one thought: find them. The moment he stepped off the plane, his body was already in mission mode, movements controlled, senses heightened. His heartbeat was slow, deliberate. No wasted energy, efficiency in every step. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, people rushing past, lost in their daily routines. But Elijah wasn't part of that world. Not right now. His father had been robbed by men wearing badges. And that meant this wasn't just a crime. It was a violation. There was only one place to go. The walk of a predator. Elijah moved through the streets of South Atlanta like a man on a mission, because that's exactly what he was. His steps were silent but heavy, his eyes scanning, absorbing everything. To the average person, he looked like just another man walking. But those who really paid attention, those who knew what to look for, would have recognized something dangerous in the way he moved. He wasn't walking, he was hunting. And his prey was waiting for him at the Atlanta Police Department, Zone 3 precinct. The building loomed ahead, a gray box of bureaucracy filled with people who probably thought they were untouchable. That was fine. Elijah wasn't here to argue. He stepped inside. "Where's Greg's?" The air in the station was thick with the usual cop shop energy, tired officers drinking stale coffee, secretaries tapping on keyboards, a couple of officers laughing near the vending machines. None of it mattered. Elijah walked straight to the front desk, where a bored-looking sergeant sat flipping through a clipboard. Without missing a beat, Elijah spoke. His voice was cold, direct. "Where's Greg's?" The sergeant barely looked up. "And you are?" he muttered, barely interested. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Elijah Walker, son of James Walker, and I want to know where that thief is." That got attention. The sergeant blinked, finally looking at him. The room shifted. Officers who had been ignoring him suddenly weren't ignoring him anymore. Conversation stopped. Even the vending machine beeped a little louder. Then, a slow, mocking voice came from behind him, the face of corruption. "Well, well," the voice drawled, "that's a big entrance for a nobody." Elijah didn't turn right away. He felt the presence before he saw it. Greg's. The man strolled out from a side office, casual as ever, his uniform crisp, his badge shining. His smirk was the kind that came from years of getting away with everything. Elijah finally turned to face him. Greg's eyes flicked over him, taking in the broad shoulders, the controlled stance, the lack of fear. Something about that last part seemed to bother him. "Hands where I can see 'em, buddy," Greg said, still smirking. "You threatening an officer?" Elijah didn't move. His face gave away nothing. Instead, he simply said, "You took my father's money." Greg's let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't know what you're talking about, pal." Elijah took a step closer. Greg's smirk twitched. "Give it back." Greg's folded his arms, tilting his head like this was all one big joke. "Or what?" he asked, his tone dripping with amusement. Elijah's expression didn't change, but his voice did. "Or you'll find out why I was the most dangerous soldier in the Green Berets." For the first time, the smirk vanished, and the room felt a little colder. For a moment, the entire precinct was frozen in silence. The kind of silence that comes right before a storm. Greg stood there, his smirk widening, eyes locked on Elijah. He wasn't afraid. Not yet. He had been in the game too long, wearing that badge like a shield, knowing that in this building, behind these walls, he was untouchable. And yet, something about Elijah bothered him. The way the man stood there, his body still, his breathing controlled, his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, locked onto him like a predator sizing up prey. Greg scoffed, tilting his head as his fingers casually brushed against the grip of his gun. "Oh, you're a tough guy, huh?" He clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "Let me remind you where you are. This is a police station? And in here?" His smirk grew. "You're just some nobody off the street." Elijah didn't blink. Instead, he did something that nobody expected. He relaxed. His shoulders loosened, his stance shifted, like he had just accepted defeat. He even lifted his hands slightly, a small, disarming movement. Greg's took the bait. He let his guard down for a fraction of a second, and that was all Elijah needed. Like a bolt of lightning, Elijah's fist smashed into Greg's gut with surgical precision. Greg's didn't even have time to react. The air rushed out of his lungs as his body buckled, knees giving out under the sheer force of the strike. His hands flailed, trying to catch something, anything, to stop himself from hitting the ground. The smirk? Gone. The confidence? Gone. All that was left was shock and the desperate struggle to breathe. The takedown. Across the room, O'Reilly's instincts kicked in. His hand shot to his holster, but he wasn't fast enough, because before his fingers could even grip the gun, Elijah was already there. In one fluid motion, he snatched O'Reilly's wrist, twisted it just enough to send a shockwave of pain through his arm, and then crack. The gun flew out of O'Reilly's hand, and before it could even hit the ground, Elijah caught it midair. Everything stopped. The room felt different now. The hunter had stepped into the den of wolves, and in a matter of seconds he had flipped the entire hierarchy upside down. Now, he was the alpha in the room. O'Reilly took a shaky step back, his hands lifted, eyes wide with pure, unfiltered terror. Elijah turned the gun over in his hand, inspecting it casually, like he was checking a new tool. Then, with the barrel still aimed directly at O'Reilly, he spoke. "Where's my father's money?" O'Reilly swallowed so hard Elijah could hear it. I don't know," his voice cracked. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Wrong answer. No escape. A sharp grunt cut through the tension. Greg's still on the floor, trying to climb back to his feet. He barely got his hands under him before Elijah's boot slammed into his chest. Greg's flew back, hitting the ground hard, coughing violently as his ribs screamed in protest. Elijah stepped over him, unshaken. "Let's try this again," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Where are the money?" Greg's wheezed, blinking rapidly, his mind scrambling for a way out. It was O'Reilly who cracked first. In the car," he stammered. "The patrol car." Elijah studied them both for a moment. Then he nodded. "Good," he said, motioning toward the door with the gun. "Show me." And just like that, the wolves became sheep, being led to the slaughter. Seconds later, Elijah was marching them out of the precinct, through the parking lot, towards their own patrol car. And every officer who watched them pass, not one dared to stop him. Greggs and O'Reilly walked ahead, their steps shaky, their confidence long gone. This was their precinct, their parking lot, their patrol car, and yet, at that moment, neither of them had ever felt more powerless. Behind them, Elijah Walker moved like a shadow with weight, a presence they could feel even without turning around. The gun was gone, slipped somewhere out of sight, but it didn't matter. He didn't need it. They both knew that now. When they reached the car, Greggs hesitated, eyes darting around the lot like he was searching for an escape, a witness, anyone who might save him from what was happening. But the truth was, nobody was coming. The same way nobody came for James Walker when they robbed him. A lesson in power. Elijah extended a hand. His fingers barely moved, but the command was clear. "Keys." Greggs swallowed hard, digging into his pocket. His fingers fumbled, his nerves betraying him. When he finally pulled them out, they slipped. The keys hit the asphalt with a metallic clink. Greggs flinched like he'd just dropped a live grenade. Elijah didn't blink. "Pick them up." Greggs hesitated, just for a second. Bad idea. Elijah took a half step forward, and that was all it took. Greggs dropped to his knees so fast you'd think he had a prayer meeting to get to. His fingers scrambled for the keys, and he nearly fumbled again as he straightened up. He unlocked the trunk with a shaking hand. The lid popped open with a soft click. The jackpot of corruption. Elijah peered inside. At first, it just looked like a mess of duffel bags and loose paperwork. Then his eyes landed on the cash. Not just his father's. A lot of it. Stacks of bills bundled together, some still in paper sleeves with bank logos on them. Elijah reached inside, pulled out a thick handful, flipping through the edges with his thumb. His jaw tightened. He looked up at Greggs and O'Reilly, his expression cold. "This a side hustle?" He tossed the cash onto the pavement at their feet. "You two just robbing folks in broad daylight now?" O'Reilly opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Greggs shifted his weight, but said nothing. His face was slick with sweat, his mind racing for an excuse. Something, anything, that would make this go away. Elijah wasn't interested in hearing it. "You shake down how many people?" His voice was calm, steady, which somehow made it worse. He gestured to the trunk. "How many folks walking around this city ain't eaten tonight because of this?" Silence. Greggs and O'Reilly might have been crooked, but even they knew there was no talking their way out of this. Elijah exhaled slowly, then grabbed his father's envelope from the pile. He flipped it open. All the money was still inside. That was almost a shame, because he was looking for an excuse. The final warning. Elijah turned back to them, weighing the envelope in his palm before slipping it into his jacket. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. "You're going to take every dollar in this trunk and put it right back where you took it from. Every single dollar." Greggs shifted, face pale. "And then?" he asked, trying and failing to keep the shake out of his voice. Elijah took a step closer. Greggs held his breath. "You," Elijah said, his eyes locking onto his like a rifle sight, "are going to disappear." O'Reilly swallowed hard. "Disappear?" he echoed. Elijah nodded. "You got two choices," he said. "One, you take your stolen money, make it right, and then you pack your bags and get out of this city." Gregg stared at him. "And if we don't?" Elijah smiled, a small smile, a dangerous smile. "Then I find you," he said, "and we have this conversation again." And just like that, the balance of power had shifted forever. The house smelled like old wood, coffee, and time, the kind of smell that carried memories, some good, some heavy. James Pop Walker sat at his kitchen table, the same table that had held Sunday breakfasts, tough conversations, and quiet prayers over unpaid bills. Tonight, though? Tonight, it held something else. Elijah walked in silent as a shadow and placed a thick envelope in front of his father. James blinked. The envelope looked exactly the way it had the last time he held it, before a couple of badge-wearing thieves took it right out of his hands. James stared at it, then at Elijah, then back at the envelope. His fingers hovered over it, hesitant, like it might disappear if he moved too fast. Finally, he picked it up, flipping it open. Every last dollar. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head in pure disbelief. "Son," his voice was quiet. "How in the world?" Elijah pulled out a chair, sat down, and leaned forward. "Don't ask," he said, voice low, unreadable. James studied his son. Elijah had always been the type to handle things his own way. Even as a kid, he had a look in his eye, the kind that said he wasn't the type to lose fights. Whatever he had done to get this money back, James knew it wasn't through polite conversation. And that worried him. He set the envelope down, pressing his fingers against it like he needed to feel that it was real. Then he sighed. "Thank you." Elijah nodded, but James wasn't finished. His brow furrowed, eyes narrowing slightly. "They just gave it back?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, stretching his shoulders. "Not exactly," he said, his tone calm. James rubbed his jaw, thinking. "Son, what did you do?" Elijah met his father's eyes. His face was unreadable, but his silence said enough. James exhaled, shaking his head again. "Lord, help us," he muttered under his breath. Elijah glanced toward the window, watching the street outside. The night was still, quiet, but he knew better than to trust that quiet. "They've got a choice now," he said finally. James raised a brow. "A choice?" Elijah nodded. "Leave it alone or be stupid." James studied his son carefully. "And if they choose stupid?" Elijah's expression didn't change. "Then I handle it." James didn't like the way that sounded, didn't like the way his son's voice was too steady, too certain, but deep down, he knew. Elijah Walker wasn't the kind of man people cross twice. Whether Greggs and O'Reilly understood that yet, that was the only question left. The squad car sat parked under the flickering glow of a street lamp, the night air thick with something heavy. Anger, humiliation, and just the right amount of fear. Inside, Greggs gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles went white. His breathing was uneven. His jaw clenched so hard it felt like his teeth might snap. O'Reilly, sitting in the passenger seat, wasn't doing much better. He had seen a lot during his years wearing a badge, but nothing like that. Nothing like a man walking into a precinct and flipping the whole damn power dynamic upside down. Greggs finally spoke, his voice sharp, venomous. "That lunatic just put his hands on us like we were nobodies." He slapped the dashboard, nostrils flaring. "He humiliated us." O'Reilly shifted, rubbing his face. "Look, man, maybe we should just let it go," he muttered, glancing out the window like he expected Elijah to be watching them even now. Greggs snapped his head towards him. "Let it go?" His voice was sharp, almost hysterical. "You saw him. That wasn't some regular guy. That was a killer, a trained ghost. You think he's just going to walk away and forget what he did?" O'Reilly hesitated. Greggs leaned in. "No, he won't. And that means we don't forget either." O'Reilly swallowed hard. "Look, man, I saw his eyes. That wasn't anger. That was something else. Something colder. You don't fight a man like that. You just stay out of his way." Greggs scoffed. "Stay out of his way? You serious?" He shook his head. "You and me, we wear badges. We're the law in this city, and you want to run and hide like some scared punk?" O'Reilly didn't answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. Badges didn't mean a thing to a man like Elijah Walker. Greggs reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. O'Reilly tensed. "What are you doing?" Greggs scrolled through his contacts, thumb hovering over a name that carried weight. "We're calling in some help," he said, guys who don't care about rules, guys who will put this wannabe soldier in the ground before he even sees it coming. O'Reilly exhaled slowly. Greggs, I'm telling you, this is a mistake. Greggs didn't listen. He hit dial, but what he didn't know. 2 blocks away, Elijah Walker watched. He stood in the shadows of a side alley, still as stone, his body blending into the night. He had followed them, because he knew men like Greggs, knew exactly how their pride worked, and he knew, without a doubt, they weren't going to let this go. He had counted on it. Now they were making the worst mistake of their lives. Elijah didn't need to hear the call to know what was happening, didn't need to see Greggs's face to know the man thought he was still in control. It almost made Elijah smile. Almost, because the truth was, Greggs wasn't the hunter in this story. He was just another target. Elijah Walker had seen this play before. Dirty cops, bruised egos, and a need to fix their humiliation the only way they knew how. Violence. It was predictable. Sloppy. And worse than that, it was stupid. From his position in the shadows, he watched as Greggs and O'Reilly worked the phone, calling in backup. Not the kind that wore uniforms. No, these were the type that knew how to break bones without leaving paperwork. 5 men, big, broad-shouldered guys with mean in their eyes, the kind who had spent their whole lives mistaking size for power. Elijah barely paid them a second glance, because they weren't the real predators in this situation. He was, and these men, they just walked onto his hunting ground. The group moved as a pack, slick and confident, like they'd done this 100 times before. Greggs was in charge, of course, but he kept his distance. The man had already learned what happened when he got too close to Elijah Walker. Let someone else do the dirty work. They spread out near Elijah's house, quiet, cautious. At least they thought they were quiet. They thought they were being careful. But they didn't know that Elijah had planned for this, didn't know that they had walked into his world now. The front yard was still. The porch light flickered once, then went out completely. Darkness. A heavy, pressing silence. One of the men, a broad guy with a shaved head, shifted uncomfortably. "Feels weird," he muttered. The guy next to him, a thick-necked brute with tattoos up his arms, rolled his eyes. "You scared of the dark, man?" he whispered. No one laughed, because deep down every single one of them felt it. Something wasn't right. The night was too quiet. No traffic, no wind, no movement, like the whole world had stopped breathing. And then, the first scream. It came from the left side of the house, sudden, sharp, and full of pure terror. The men whipped around, weapons drawn, but there was nothing there, just empty shadows. "Where the hell did he go?" one of them hissed said. Another scream, this time behind them. One of their own was gone. Just gone. Vanished into the dark. And now they understood. They weren't the hunters, they were the hunted. Panic set in. The big guys, the ones who walked in here all tough, thinking this would be easy, they weren't so confident anymore. Their movements got sloppy, their breathing got too loud, and in the middle of it all, Elijah Walker moved like a ghost. A shadow between shadows. They never saw him coming. Not until it was too late. One by one, he took them apart. Fast, efficient, no wasted movement, no mercy. This wasn't a fight, this was an execution. And by the time the last man realized what was happening, there was no one left to help him. He stood there, alone, chest heaving, turning in wild circles, trying to see something, anything. And then, a voice. Low, calm, deadly. "You boys picked the wrong house." A whisper in the dark. Then, everything went black. Elijah Walker didn't hesitate, didn't second guess, didn't stop moving. He wasn't like them. A group of overconfident thugs hiding behind badges and numbers. They thought bringing more men gave them an advantage. It didn't, because they weren't trained for this. He was. And now, they were his prey. The first officer never saw the strike coming. One moment, he was steady on his feet, gun raised, scanning the darkness. The next, his legs were gone. Elijah swept low, taking him out with a powerful, precise strike behind the knees. The man's body crashed to the ground, spine slamming against the cold dirt. His gun tumbled out of his hand, landing uselessly on the pavement. He wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. The second officer barely had a chance to react. He flinched, his hand flying to his holster, fingers brushing the grip of his weapon. Too slow. Elijah was already inside his guard. His hand snapped forward, grabbing the officer's wrist and twisting just enough to send a jolt of pain through the tendons. The man yelped, his grip breaking. The gun was gone before he could even register it. By the time he realized what had happened, a devastating elbow to the ribs crushed the air from his lungs. His body folded. His knees hit the pavement. His head followed, 2 down. That's when O'Reilly's nerves finally shattered. The officer had been standing just a few feet away, gripping his weapon, watching everything. But that was the problem. Watching was all he had done. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, and now, he was alone. Where the hell is he? O'Reilly spun in place, gun raised, eyes darting in every direction. But he wouldn't see him first. He never would. The shadows were too deep. The night was too quiet. And Elijah? Elijah was everywhere and nowhere at once. O'Reilly's hands were shaking. He pressed the button on his radio with a white-knuckled grip. "Unit down. I repeat, unit." The radio was ripped from his grasp. Vanished. Gone. His stomach twisted into knots. His pulse thundered. It was there. It had been there. Now it wasn't. Something moved behind him. Not a footstep, not a breath, just a shift, like the air itself was bending around him. And then a whisper, right in his ear. Too late. O'Reilly's brain barely processed the words before a force like a freight train collided with his chest. His body flew backward, weightless for a split second before the trunk of a squad car stopped his momentum violently. His back slammed against the metal, his vision exploded with light, his lungs locked up, struggling to suck in air. He gasped. He reached for his weapon, but before his fingers could even close around it, pressure hit his throat. Not crushing, not choking, just enough to remind him he wasn't in control anymore. Elijah stood over him, face calm, voice steady, like this was routine. "That's 3 down." O'Reilly's heart pounded against his ribs, his eyes darting around, searching for anything, anyone. But there was no one left to help him, just 2 more men out there. And they were already running out of time. Greggs ran. Not walked, not moved fast, ran. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one sharper than the last. His legs burned, his chest tightened, and his heart slammed against his ribs like a war drum. He didn't dare look back, because he knew. Elijah Walker was behind him, not sprinting, not chasing like some madman in a panic. No, Elijah didn't need to rush. Greggs could feel it, that cold, steady presence closing in, like a shadow stretching long across the pavement, like something inevitable. The squad car sat ahead, parked under the flickering glow of a street lamp. His salvation, his way out. If he could just reach it. Greggs fumbled with his belt, his fingers trembling so badly that the keys nearly slipped from his grasp. The second he reached the door, he yanked it open and threw himself inside. He jammed the key into the ignition, twisting so hard his knuckles went white. Click. The engine roared to life. He exhaled, chest heaving. Almost there, and then the door was gone. Not opened. Gone. 1 second it was there, his hand gripping the handle in desperation. The next, it was ripped straight off its hinges. Greggs barely had time to turn his head before a steel grip clamped onto his collar, and then he was airborne. For a moment, weightless. Then, impact. His back slammed into the pavement, knocking the breath from his lungs in a violent, chest-crushing gasp. His skull bounced off the ground, and his vision erupted in white-hot sparks before darkness threatened to take over. The world spun. His ears rang. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the metallic clink of his keys hitting the ground. He tried to move, tried to force himself upright, but his limbs felt slow, disconnected. That's when he saw the shadow move over him. Not just any shadow. Him. Elijah Walker stood above him, calm, controlled, completely unshaken. Greggs gasped, still trying to catch his breath, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His mind was screaming at him to do something. Run, fight, beg, anything. But he didn't, because he knew. It wouldn't matter, because this wasn't just some thug he could shake down. This wasn't some scared civilian who would back down at the sight of a badge. This was a soldier, a man who had spent years hunting people for a living, a man who, in a matter of minutes, had already picked apart his entire crew like they were nothing. Greggs had spent his whole life believing he was untouchable, but now, lying there on his back, staring up at the unshakable force towering over him, he understood. He had never been untouchable. He had just never faced a real threat before. Elijah didn't speak at first, didn't gloat, didn't ask for apologies. He just looked down at Greggs with that same unreadable expression, cold, calculating, like this was just another job to get done. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, steady, deadly. "I warned you." Greggs barely had time to process the words. Then Elijah swung. A single, devastating blow. Greggs's head snapped back. His body jerked once, then went completely still. The parking lot was silent. The night stretched on. The squad car was still running, its engine humming softly. But Greggs wouldn't be driving it, wouldn't be moving at all, because by the time Elijah's fist landed, his world had already gone black. Elijah Walker stood in the center of the parking lot, surrounded by bodies that used to believe they were untouchable. The only sounds were the faint hum of the squad car's still-running engine and the ragged breathing of the men who were still conscious enough to realize how badly they had lost. Greggs lay sprawled out, motionless, his head turned awkwardly to the side. O'Reilly sat slumped against the car, his ribs battered, his hands shaking, his face twisted in something between pain and disbelief. The others, the so-called backup Greggs had called in to take Elijah out, weren't faring much better. One of them was curled up on his side, gasping like a fish out of water. Another was still on his hands and knees, coughing up the fight that had been beaten out of him. The last man, the one who thought size made him dangerous, was flat on his back, staring up at the night sky like he was having a personal conversation with the stars. Elijah watched them all, watched their hands, their breathing, the subtle shifts of their bodies. They were done, not just physically, mentally. Because now they understood something they should have figured out a long time ago. They were never in control of this situation. Not from the moment they called their little ambush, not from the moment they stepped foot on his street, not ever. He could see it in their eyes, the slow, sinking realization that the power they thought they had was a lie. For the first time, they knew what it was like to be powerless. Elijah inhaled deeply, then exhaled slow and steady. His fists were still clenched, not out of rage, not from adrenaline, but out of discipline. Because men like these, they didn't deserve mercy. They didn't deserve second chances. They didn't deserve to walk away. But unlike them, Elijah Walker wasn't a coward, and unlike them, he knew how to control himself. He took a slow step forward. The few officers still awake flinched. That reaction, it told him everything. He could feel the weight of their fear, the way their minds were scrambling for an exit. There wasn't one. He stopped just in front of O'Reilly, staring down at the man who couldn't meet his eyes. Elijah studied him for a moment, then shook his head, exhaling sharply. "You're lucky I'm not like you," he said, voice low, even. O'Reilly's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching against the pavement. The other men barely reacted, too broken to do anything but breathe. And that was worse than any hit Elijah could have thrown, because they knew what he meant. They knew that if the roles were reversed, if Elijah had been the one on the ground, powerless, with them standing over him, there wouldn't have been a choice. They would have finished him without hesitation. And yet, here they were, still breathing, still able to go home. Because unlike them, Elijah wasn't a bully in a uniform. He turned, stepping away from them, his footsteps slow, deliberate. He could have ended it there, could have walked away, let them sit with their bruises and their humiliation. But something in him, the part of him that had been trained to finish what he started, knew that a lesson wasn't complete without a reminder, a permanent one. So, just as he reached the edge of the lot, he stopped, didn't turn around, didn't need to. His voice cut through the night like a blade. "If you try this again," he said, his tone calm, steady, absolute, the kind of tone that didn't invite argument, the kind of tone that told them this wasn't a warning, this was a sentence. "No one will ever find you." O'Reilly inhaled sharply. The others? They didn't move, because something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, emotionless, made it clear he wasn't bluffing. They were alive because he allowed it, and if they were stupid enough to come after him again, there wouldn't be a warning next time. There wouldn't be a next time at all. James Walker sat at the old wooden table, the same table where he had eaten breakfast with his son as a boy, the same table where he had once helped Elijah with homework, and the same table where he had prayed over unpaid bills, wondering how to stretch $1 a little further. Now, that same table held something else entirely. His money. Every last dollar. Neatly stacked inside the envelope, exactly the way it had been before those two cops ripped it from his hands like they were entitled to it. Like he was nothing. James let out a slow breath, his rough fingers grazing the edges of the bills. It felt surreal. He had spent decades knowing how the world worked. A black man in this country didn't get stolen from by cops and get his money back. That just wasn't how the system worked. But somehow, Elijah had made it happen. And that made James pause. His eyes lifted from the envelope, settling on his son, who sat across the table, his expression unreadable. Elijah was calm. Too calm. Not the kind of calm that came after a peaceful resolution. No, this was the kind of calm James had seen before. The kind of calm that came after a storm. James studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Then he sighed, rubbing his fingers over his temple. "You did something, didn't you?" It wasn't really a question, more like a statement of fact. Elijah didn't answer right away, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, just sat there, quiet, his face completely still. James let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, that was an answer. "You know what?" James muttered, shaking his head. "I don't think I even want to know." Elijah still didn't say anything. Didn't need to, because they both understood. Whatever happened tonight wasn't something that could be put into words. James wasn't naive. He might have been an old man now, but he had seen plenty in his lifetime. He had seen men take justice into their own hands because the system, sure as hell, wasn't built to give it to them. And Elijah wasn't the type to let a thing like a badge stand between him and what was right. So, yeah. James didn't need details, didn't need to hear about what had gone down, because the money was here. And more importantly, James still had his son sitting in front of him. Finally, after a long pause, James exhaled, shaking his head. "But I'll tell you one thing." Elijah looked up. "I'm proud of you." The words hung in the air, settling into the space between them, like something solid, unshakable. Elijah didn't react right away, didn't smirk, didn't crack some joke, didn't brush it off like it wasn't a big deal, because it was a big deal. James Walker wasn't a man who handed out words like that freely. For a long time, Elijah just sat there, his face still, his mind somewhere far away. Then, finally, the corner of his lips pulled up into the smallest, faintest smile. Not cocky, not smug, just real. "Thanks, Pop." That was all. And really, that was all that needed to be said. Because in that moment, they both understood something without saying it out loud. This wasn't over. It never really was. But whatever came next, whatever storm was still on the horizon, they would handle it, together. The city had its own way of spreading news, not through official statements, not through breaking reports on the 6 o'clock news. No, real news, the kind that mattered, traveled in whispers. It moved between barbershop chairs, passed over steaming cups of coffee in corner diners, exchanged in hushed tones outside liquor stores and church steps alike. And lately, those whispers had changed. "You hear about those cops?" The question would come low, careful, like saying it too loud might pull something into the room. "The ones from Zone 3? Yeah, Greg's, O'Reilly, and a few of their boys." A pause, a glance toward the door, a sip of coffee. "They're gone." "Gone? What you mean, gone?" "Just gone. Like they up and left." And just like that, a shift would happen. A tension in the air. Men who had been laughing a second ago suddenly weren't. Women who had been chatting about their kids lowered their voices. Because things like this didn't happen. Not here. Not like this. "No, man, that don't sound right." They weren't the quitting type. No, they weren't. And that's when the theories would start. Some people said they got transferred, quietly moved somewhere else to avoid embarrassment. Some said they were running from something. Maybe the kind of dirt even their own couldn't protect them from. But others weren't so sure. "You really believe they just left?" "Those guys? The same ones who've been running dirty for years?" "Nah." A slow shake of the head. Somebody handled it. That phrase always landed heavy. Handled it. It wasn't an accusation, wasn't even a statement. It was an understanding, a silent agreement between everyone in the conversation. A thing known, but never spoken aloud. Because in a place like this, when bad men just disappear, you don't ask questions, not if you were smart, because asking questions might mean you get answers. And some answers ain't meant to be heard. So people nodded, shrugged, changed the subject, let the city move on, because what else was there to say? Nobody missed Greg's and O'Reilly, nobody cried for them, nobody cared where they went. Because however it happened, however it went down, the city was better off without them. That was enough. That was all that needed to be known. Except for one person. One person who didn't need to ask. One person who didn't wonder. Because while the city whispered, while people speculated, while theories floated through the streets like smoke, Elijah Walker didn't have to guess. He knew the truth, because he was the one who made it happen. The station was quieter than usual, not the normal hum of paperwork, ringing phones, and radio chatter that usually filled the precinct. This was different. It was heavy, like the whole building was holding its breath. And at the center of it, in a dimly lit office tucked in the back of the station, sat two men who used to feel untouchable, Greg's and O'Reilly. Neither had been sleeping much. The bags under their eyes told that story clear enough. Their usual arrogance, the swagger, the easy confidence of men who thought they owned this city, was long gone. Because for the first time in their careers, they weren't the ones in control. And worse, they didn't know what to do about it. Greg sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, fingers laced together so tight his knuckles went white. O'Reilly wasn't much better, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, eyes flicking toward the door every few seconds, like he was expecting something to come through it, like he knew something was coming. And then the door opened. Captain Harris stepped inside. The second they saw him, they knew. The look on his face, the way he shut the door quietly, locking it behind him. The way he just stood there for a moment, letting the silence stretch long enough to make them sweat. They knew. It was worse than they thought. Greg swallowed hard. "Cap?" His voice was rough, hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in hours. Harris exhaled through his nose, then moved toward the desk, lowering himself slowly into the chair. He didn't speak right away, just looked at them, studied them. O'Reilly shifted again, his nerves getting the better of him. Then, finally, Harris spoke. "Greg's, O'Reilly." His voice was calm, but not reassuring. "We have a problem." O'Reilly tensed. Greg's felt a knot tighten in his gut. They didn't ask what, because they already knew what. And yet, hearing it out loud made it real. O'Reilly forced a swallow. "This guy," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper, He's not normal." Harris didn't blink, didn't disagree, just nodded. "Yeah," the captain said, his voice heavy. "And now?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "He's watching you." Silence. Thick, suffocating. O'Reilly exhaled sharply, a nervous, choked-out breath. Greggs clenched his jaw so tight it hurt. They didn't need details. They didn't need reports or surveillance footage, because they could feel it. Feel the weight of something unseen, like eyes that were never really gone, like shadows that moved even when nothing was there. Elijah Walker wasn't just a problem. He was a presence, a force they couldn't shake. And if he was watching, that meant one thing. He wasn't finished with them yet. Elijah Walker sat in his father's living room, eyes locked on the flickering glow of the television screen. The news anchor spoke in her usual polished, rehearsed tone, reading from the teleprompter with the kind of detachment that only came from not really understanding the story she was telling. Reports indicate that several officers from the Atlanta Police Department's Zone 3 precinct have recently taken leave or transferred out of the city under unclear circumstances. While the department has not released an official statement, sources suggest the sudden departures may be linked to ongoing internal investigations. Elijah let out a slow breath through his nose, his expression unreadable. Investigations. That was their way of saving face. Nobody wanted to admit what really happened. Nobody wanted to say out loud that a few of their own had gone too far and paid the price for it. So instead they wrapped it in bureaucratic language and hoped people would lose interest. But Elijah? He wasn't interested in their spin. He was interested in results. And as far as he was concerned, this was a win. Across the room, James sat in his old armchair, the soft hum of the news filling the silence between them. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a habit Elijah had picked up on over the years, a tell that meant his father was thinking. Finally, James spoke. "City's been quieter lately." His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something knowing. Elijah didn't look away from the screen. "Yeah," he said simply, because what else was there to say? They both knew why. James studied his son for a long moment, his eyes tracing the stillness in Elijah's posture, the way his hands rested on his knees, relaxed, but always ready. Elijah wasn't celebrating. He wasn't gloating, because for him, this wasn't about revenge. It was about correction. The city had been out of balance. The wrong people had been in control. And now, things had shifted. The bad cops were gone. The people who had been too scared to speak up before, they had a little more room to breathe. The weight that had been pressing down on these streets, lighter. James exhaled, leaning back in his chair, nodding to himself. "I guess sometimes you gotta clean house," he murmured. Elijah finally turned to look at him, and for the first time that night, he allowed himself to smile. "Yeah," he said, "sometimes you do." And with that, he grabbed the remote and clicked off the TV, because there was nothing else to see. He already knew how the story ended. Greg sat behind the wheel of his beat-up sedan, hands clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles had gone pale. His breath was uneven, short and shallow, like his lungs had forgotten how to work. He had always thought of himself as a tough guy, the kind of man who owned the streets he patrolled, who could push people around and never face the consequences. But now he was running. His car idled at a red light, the engine humming softly beneath him. His bags were stuffed into the back seat, his entire life packed into a few cheap suitcases. He had left behind his uniform, his badge, everything, because none of it meant anything anymore. Not after him, not after Elijah Walker. Greg swallowed hard, gripping the wheel even tighter as his mind replayed that night. The darkness, the silence, the way men disappeared right in front of him, like they had never existed in the first place, the way Elijah moved, the way he looked at him after it was over, calm, collected, completely unaffected. Greggs had seen a lot in his life, but he had never seen a man like that, A man who could take down 5 trained officers without breaking a sweat. A man who, with just a few words, had made it very clear that if Greggs stayed in Atlanta, he wouldn't stay breathing for long. The light turned green. Greggs didn't move at first, because leaving meant admitting it. Admitting that he had lost. That all those years of pushing people around, using his badge like a weapon, taking whatever he wanted because he thought he was untouchable. It was over. He wasn't untouchable. He was replaceable, expendable, forgettable. A car behind him honked, jolting him out of his daze. Greg swallowed hard, shoved his foot onto the gas pedal, and pulled onto the highway. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, watching as the city lights grew smaller and smaller behind him. This wasn't just a road trip. It wasn't a fresh start. It was an escape. Because for the first time in his life, Greggs knew true fear. Not the fear of losing a fight, not the fear of getting caught, the fear of being hunted. And the worst part? He knew, deep down, that even as he put mile after mile between himself and Atlanta, even as he drove through new cities, changed his phone number, tried to build a life somewhere far away, Elijah Walker would always be in the back of his mind. Because men like Elijah didn't just go away. They watched. They waited. And if you made the wrong move, they found you. Far in the distance, parked in the shadows of an overpass, Elijah Walker stood beside his car, arms crossed over his chest, watching the faint glow of tail lights disappearing down the road. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just stood there, watching. Because that's all he needed to do. Greggs was gone. One less problem, one less enemy, one step closer to peace. O'Reilly sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of a single lamp casting long shadows against the walls. His place was a mess. Half-packed bags, unopened letters, and a nearly empty bottle of whiskey sitting next to a crumpled fast food wrapper. He hadn't slept in days. Not really. Not the kind of sleep that made a difference. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw him. Elijah Walker. The way he moved. The way he made men disappear into the dark like they had never existed in the first place. The way he had stood over Greggs, calm and unshaken, as if none of it had even mattered. O'Reilly had been a cop long enough to know what fear looked like. But this wasn't fear. This was something worse. This was knowing, without a doubt, that he was outmatched, that if he made the wrong move, if he so much as thought about revenge, he wouldn't just lose, he wouldn't exist anymore. He leaned forward, rubbing his face with both hands, trying to block out the voices in his head. Greggs had run, packed his bags, hopped in his car, and never looked back. At first, O'Reilly had thought about doing the same. Disappearing, leaving Atlanta behind, but something about that felt wrong, like he'd be carrying a ghost with him no matter where he went. So, instead, he had stayed. Stayed to wrestle with the one question that had been clawing at his mind since that night. Fight or survive? That was it. That was the choice. He could try to fight back, try to gather what little power he had left, maybe even call in favors from the kind of men who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. Try to convince himself that a badge still meant something, even after everything he had seen. Try to pretend that he could somehow come out of this alive, or he could accept it. Accept that the rules had changed, that he wasn't a predator anymore, that he never really was, that Elijah Walker was something else entirely. O'Reilly exhaled slowly, pressing his palms flat against the kitchen table. His heartbeat was steady now, his breathing even, because he knew the answer. He had known it from the moment he saw Greggs lying motionless on the pavement, from the moment he felt Elijah's grip around his throat, cold and unshaken, from the moment he heard that whisper, "If you try this again, no one will ever find you." O'Reilly didn't need to hear it twice. Better to live, better to walk away and keep breathing, better to take the lesson and move on. He reached across the table, grabbed his badge, and turned it over in his hands. For years, he had thought this little piece of metal made him untouchable. But now it just felt like a target. With a slow, deliberate motion, he set it down on the table, not because he was quitting, but because he understood. There was only one way to move forward. Leave Elijah Walker alone. Forget about him. Act like he never existed, because men like Elijah didn't just win fights, they erased their enemies. And O'Reilly? O'Reilly wanted to keep existing. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Atlanta had a sound to it, a heartbeat of car engines, distant sirens, voices carried by the wind. But tonight, the world outside James Walker's house felt still, like even the city itself knew something had changed. Elijah and James sat on the front porch, rocking slowly in their chairs. The old wooden planks creaked beneath them, the rhythm familiar, steady, like the countless nights before when they had sat out here, just the two of them, letting the world fade into the background. But this night felt different. James stared out at the empty street, hands resting on the armrests of his chair, his fingers drumming a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Then, without turning his head, he spoke. "You think they'll come back?" His voice was steady, casual, but Elijah knew the weight behind the question. Greg's, O'Reilly, the others. Men like them didn't take humiliation lightly, didn't accept defeat easily, unless they understood. Elijah took a slow sip of his tea, letting the warmth settle in his chest. He didn't rush his answer, didn't need to. Finally, he set his cup down on the small wooden table beside him and exhaled through his nose. No. James turned his head slightly, studying his son's face. Elijah wasn't just answering the question. He was stating a fact. "They're gone for good?" James asked, raising an eyebrow. Elijah nodded once. "They know better." There was no arrogance in his voice, no bravado, just certainty, because men like Greg's and O'Reilly, they weren't brave. They were opportunists. They were the type to take from those who couldn't fight back, to flash a badge and use it as a weapon. But when the fight came to them, when they met someone who didn't flinch, they ran, and if they were smart, they wouldn't stop running. James leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly as if rolling the answer around in his head. A part of him still wasn't used to this, to knowing that his son had become a force that men feared. But another part of him, the part that had seen too much, the part that had been beaten down by the world more times than he could count, that part understood, and that part knew. Some fights weren't won in courtrooms. Some fights weren't solved with justice. Some fights had to be settled in the dark. James sighed, stretching his legs out. "I guess that's that, then." Elijah picked up his tea again, taking another sip. "Yeah." The wind shifted slightly, rustling the trees, carrying the distant hum of the city back towards them. James let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "What day?" James turned to him, eyes filled with something between pride and disbelief. "The day the bad guys learned how to be afraid." Elijah didn't smile, didn't react, just took another sip of tea. Because his father was right. They were afraid, and for the first time in a long time, the city finally felt right. The morning was still. For the first time in a long time, James Walker felt at ease. No tension, no waiting for the next problem. Just the soft hum of the city, the rustling of trees, and above it all, birdsong. He rocked in his chair, letting the moment settle, his eyes drifting to the man beside him. Elijah sat quietly, coffee in hand, eyes on the street, always watching, always ready. James smiled, nodding to himself. "Thank you, son." Elijah took a slow sip, his answer simple. "Always, Pop." And just like that, James knew everything was finally as it should be. The city was different now, not on the surface. Atlanta still moved like it always had. Cars filled the streets, neon lights flickered in shop windows, and the hum of life carried on. But beneath it, things had changed. The wrong men weren't as bold anymore, the kind of guys who used to walk with unchecked arrogance. Crooked cops, street hustlers who thought fear was a currency, the ones who thrived on people keeping their heads down. They had started looking over their shoulders. because something had shifted. They didn't own these streets anymore. Fear had changed sides. And though no one said his name, though no news station reported on him, though no official statement was ever made, Elijah Walker was the reason. He didn't need credit, didn't need headlines, because real power didn't need recognition. Elijah stood on his father's porch, watching the city breathe under the glow of the streetlights. He could feel it, the way things were settling, the way people walked with a little less weight on their shoulders. But he also knew peace was temporary. Men like Greggs and O'Reilly, they were gone. But others would come, others would try to take what wasn't theirs, push the weak, test the limits. That's how the world worked. Elijah didn't fear that. He accepted it. Because if anything started again, if the city ever called for him to step forward once more, he would be ready. And this time, he wouldn't need to give a warning. The end.